The universe never cared for humanity. At least, that's what Commander Harlon believed as he stood alone in the command deck of the Valkyrie, the last human warship still drifting under its own power. Earth was gone, burned under the Empire's fleets like it was nothing more than a dirt stain on a galactic boot. The colonies followed soon after, each one snuffed out with brutal efficiency. Humanity was not conquered. They were erased. And yet, here he was, the last defiant ember in a sea of cold stars. Harlon wasn't supposed to be alive. Neither was his crew. The Valkyrie had been declared lost 6 months ago after the Battle of Asterion, where 20 human warships were swallowed whole by the Empire's armada. 20 ships died, but somehow one limped away, engines bleeding plasma, hull shattered, and life support hanging by a thread. The Valkyrie should have been finished that day, and maybe it would have been better if it had. But men like Harlon didn't die easy. The Valkyrie had been designed as a relic of desperation, a ship humanity never intended to build until extinction was clawing at their throat. It was an experimental dreadnought, wrapped in weapons so illegal under galactic law that their very blueprints could earn death sentences. Railguns that tore holes in moons, plasma torpedoes designed to crack stations in two, and a reactor that burned hotter than the heart of a sun. The ship wasn't built for defense. It was built to kill, to remind the stars that humanity was not prey, but predators who had been caged too long. The crew had been pared down to less than 100 souls now. Once, there had been 3,000. Now, the mess hall was half empty, the corridors silent, and every face carried the same haunted look. Survivors who had seen too much, lost too much, but refused to die quietly. They didn't look at Harlon as a savior. They looked at him as the man dragging them into hell one last time. Word reached them of the Empire's grand gathering, a victory celebration, they called it, a fleet mustering in orbit of Kairos Prime, the jewel of the galactic throne. Thousands of ships assembled to watch their emperor declare the death of humanity official, his voice broadcast across half the galaxy. They expected no resistance, no defiance, no flicker of rebellion. Humanity was dust under their boots. Harlon saw something else. He saw opportunity. Standing before the cracked viewing screen, he whispered to himself, not caring if the bridge crew heard. One night. That's all we need. One night to remind them who we are. The plan was madness. Every officer knew it. Charging into the Empire's core with a single warship against thousands was suicide of the highest order. But there was something in the air of the Valkyrie, something that had taken root in the hearts of men who had nothing left to lose. A single word whispered from station to station, cabin to cabin, until it reached even the lowest deckhand. Revenge. The ship itself seemed to share the hunger. Systems long considered unstable surged with a kind of cruel vitality. The engines screamed for release. The reactor's warning lights glowed like bloodshot eyes, as if the beast wanted to be unleashed. The Valkyrie wasn't just a ship. It was the last weapon of a dying species, forged for a single purpose. When the course was plotted for Kairos Prime, no one argued. They just strapped in. The jump tore reality apart around them, and the crew braced as the ship hurled itself through the black. Silence fell on the bridge, broken only by the harsh rasp of recycled air and the distant thrum of the reactor. They weren't soldiers anymore. They were executioners. And when the stars bent back into place, the view that met them was almost holy. Kairos Prime hung below, its oceans reflecting the light of its twin suns, cities glittering like jewels across its surface. But above it, in orbit, the true sight, an armada stretching across the void, tens of thousands of ships locked in perfect formation, banners of the Empire glowing on their hulls. The fleet of fleets, a sight meant to intimidate, to proclaim dominance over every species in the galaxy. Harlon leaned forward in his chair, his knuckles white against the armrests. His voice was low, sharp, and final. Target the Emperor's flagship. No hesitation, no fear. And the Valkyrie, the last warship of a dead race, roared to life. The silence before battle was always the worst part. The bridge of the Valkyrie was bathed in dim red light, the glow of warning signals reflecting off metal panels scarred from old battles. Men and women sat rigid at their stations, eyes fixed on their displays, though none of them needed to look at the data to know the truth. They were staring down the largest fleet in history, and they were only one ship. Commander Harlon sat in his chair at the center, boots planted firmly on the deck, hands gripping the armrests with a calm that bordered on defiance. His face was hard, carved by years of war and failure. But there was something in his eyes, a gleam that refused to fade even when everything else had been torn from him. "Status report," he said, his voice steady despite the tension crackling through the air like static. "Reactor at 120%, the chief engineer replied, voice trembling despite his attempt at professionalism. "She's running hot, Commander, real hot. We can't hold this output forever." "Don't need forever," Harlon said without looking at him. "Just the night." Weapons Officer Lyra, one of the few veterans still alive from Mysterion, turned in her chair. Her face was pale under the crimson glow. "Primary railguns online, plasma torpedoes armed, shields holding, but they'll crack under sustained fire. Sir, once we fire, they'll all come for us." "That's the idea," Harlon said. A heavy silence followed, the kind that pressed down on every chest like a weight. Each crew member knew what this was, not a mission, not a battle, but a funeral march. Still, not one of them stood to leave. Harlon rose from his chair and stepped toward the forward viewport. Beyond the thick glass, Kiros Prime gleamed like a jewel, its seas a perfect sapphire, its continents sprawled in shining cities. Above it, the Emperor's fleet stretched across the heavens. Tens of thousands of warships aligned in flawless symmetry. At the heart of it, larger than any vessel humanity had ever dared build, floated the Emperor's flagship, a monstrosity of black steel, kilometers long, bristling with weapons that could erase planets. Its hull bore the sigil of the Empire, a crown of stars, eternal and unchallenged. Harlon clenched his fists. "They think we're broken," he said, low but loud enough for the bridge to hear. "They think we're dust under their boots. Tonight we show them we are fire. Set firing solutions. Target the flagship." "Yes, Commander," Lyra whispered, hands flying over her console. On her screen, targeting reticles locked onto the Emperor's flagship. The ship was so massive, so arrogant in its position at the fleet's heart, that it made for the perfect mark. They weren't aiming to wound. They were aiming to gut the beast where it felt safest. "Railguns primed," Lyra said. Her voice shook, but her hands were steady. The ship's AI, a cold female voice that had never faltered in tone, echoed through the bridge. "Warning. Firing primary railguns at this output will compromise structural integrity." "Do it anyway," Harlon growled. The hum of the Valkyrie's reactor deepened. A throbbing growl that vibrated through the deck plates. The railguns charged, drawing power straight from the overclocked core. Lights flickered. Panels groaned. The very walls seemed to shiver as though the ship itself understood the weight of what it was about to do. "Fire!" the Valkyrie roared. Twin streaks of molten metal ripped into the void, glowing with a fury no shield could withstand. They crossed the gulf of space in seconds, smashing into the Emperor's flagship with the force of mountains hurled at supersonic speed. The first slug tore through its forward shields as if they were mist, ripping straight through the hull and detonating deep inside. The second slammed into its central spine, snapping entire decks like twigs. For one heartbeat, silence. Then the Emperor's flagship exploded. The blast lit the heavens brighter than a star, a blinding flare that shattered formations and sent shockwaves rippling through the armada. Fragments the size of cities spun outward, colliding with nearby cruisers, tearing them apart in chain reactions of fire and death. On the Valkyrie's bridge, no one breathed. "Direct hit," Lyra whispered, awe breaking through her fear. "The flagship is it's gone." Gone. The Emperor's pride, his symbol of eternal dominance, obliterated in less than a minute by a ship that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. Panic rippled through the enemy fleet. Formations broke as ships scrambled to compensate, captains screaming orders as they tried to make sense of the impossible. An empire that had ruled unchallenged for 1,000 years had just been wounded, and worse, it had been wounded by the species they thought extinct. A voice broke through the silence of the bridge. The communications officer, pale and trembling, stared at his headset. "They're broadcasting, sir. Open channels everywhere. They're demanding to know who's attacking." Harlon's lips curled into something that might have been called a smile, if not for the bitterness in it. "Put me through." The officer hesitated, then nodded. A second later, the Emperor's fleet was listening. Harlon leaned forward, his voice carrying like a blade through the ether. "This is Commander Harlon of the Valkyrie. Humanity is not dead. Humanity is not broken. Tonight we remind you what fear feels like." He cut the transmission before they could answer. The response was immediate. Thousands of ships pivoted toward them, weapons powering up in a storm of light. The heavens lit with fury as beams, torpedoes, and slugs converged on their position. "Evasive maneuvers!" Harlon barked. "Keep us moving! Fire at will! Anything in range!" The Valkyrie moved like a predator unleashed, her engines screaming as she dove between capital ships, railguns firing in thunderous rhythm. Plasma torpedoes streaked from her launch bays, carving burning trails through destroyers and frigates. Each shot ripped through ships 10 times her size, tearing them open like fragile toys. But the enemy firestorm was relentless. Beams scorched across the Valkyrie's shields, making them flare and crack. Explosions rattled the hull as glancing blows smashed into her armor. Consoles sparked, men screamed as systems overloaded, spraying shrapnel. "Shields at 60%, someone shouted. "Keep firing," Harlon roared back. "We take as many as we can." They dove through a cluster of cruisers, the Valkyrie's guns spitting molten death. 3 ships split apart under her barrage, but one managed to land a direct hit against their port side. The impact rocked the entire vessel, throwing crew from their chairs, alarms shrieking in every corridor. "Port batteries offline," Lyra shouted. "Hull breach in sections 13 through 16. "Seal it," Harlon snapped. "We're not done yet." The Valkyrie twisted, diving toward the densest cluster of enemy ships. Torpedoes streaked outward, detonating in brilliant blossoms of fire that tore through formations. For everyone they killed, 10 more bore down on them, but the Valkyrie fought like a wounded beast, refusing to fall. On the bridge, sweat dripped down faces, hands bled from gripping consoles too tightly, but no one stopped. The ship howled and bled, but it killed and killed and killed. "Reactor overheating," the engineer cried. "We can't hold this output much longer. Commander, she'll blow." Harlon stared at the tactical display, at the swarm of enemy ships converging on them like vultures. His jaw tightened. "Then we make the explosion count." The crew went silent. They knew what he meant. They knew what it would cost. But not one of them spoke against him. because they had nothing left to lose. The Valkyrie cut through the chaos like a wounded predator, her engines howling, her guns spitting steel and fire. Every breath on the bridge tasted of smoke and ozone, the stench of circuits burning as panels sparked and consoles blew. The ship wasn't supposed to survive this kind of onslaught. And yet she did, not because she was indestructible, but because she was furious. The Emperor's fleet swarmed like a hive awakened, thousands of ships converging, weapons blazing. To them, it was impossible that a single vessel could do this much damage. They had trained for wars against entire species, not against one ship piloted by a dying race's ghosts. They weren't ready for the Valkyrie. "Direct hit on their carrier!" Lyra shouted, sweat running down her temple as her hands flew across the firing controls. On the main screen, a massive alien carrier split in two, its guts spilling out into the void as explosions chained across its decks. Fighter swarms inside were snuffed out before they could even launch. But the retaliation came fast. "Impact on Deck 9!" another officer cried. "We've lost power to forward life support." "Seal it off," Harlon ordered, his voice flat. That meant men and women would die gasping for air, sealed behind bulkheads so the rest could keep fighting. His stomach twisted, but he didn't let it show. His job wasn't to grieve. His job was to kill. "Commander," Lyra said suddenly, her voice sharp. "Multiple cruisers converging on R6. They're trying to box us in." Harlan's jaw tightened. He leaned forward, eyes fixed on the tactical display. Red icons swarmed around their single blue mark, tightening like a noose. "Helm," he said. "Take us straight through them. Full burn." The helmsman looked back at him, disbelief written plain on his soot-streaked face. "Sir, straight through? We'll—" "Do it!" Harlon barked. The helmsman swallowed hard and shoved the throttles forward. The Valkyrie's engines screamed like banshees as the ship lurched forward, accelerating into the teeth of the trap. The enemy cruisers closed in, their cannons lighting up the dark with lances of plasma and streaking torpedoes. "Brace!" Harlon roared. The first barrage slammed into their shields, making the entire ship shudder. Sparks cascaded from the ceiling as lights flickered. Alarms wailed. A torpedo detonated too close, tearing a gash across their port-side armor. "Shields at 30%, someone yelled. "Keep her steady!" Harlon shouted. The Valkyrie barreled forward, railguns pounding, tearing holes in cruisers as they closed in on either side. One exploded in a fireball, fragments hammering their hull. Another managed to rake them with beam fire, carving molten scars across the armor. "Starboard batteries fire!" Harlon snapped. The guns roared, slamming molten slugs into the enemy cruiser's bridge. The ship split apart, bodies and debris spilling into the void. "Forward torpedoes, now!" A swarm of plasma torpedoes streaked ahead, detonating in the heart of the blockade. The explosion tore a gap through the enemy formation, a burning hole in the noose tightening around them. "Engage ramming thrusters," Harlon ordered. The crew froze. "Sir?" the helmsman asked, wide-eyed. "Do it." The ship's underbelly thrusters ignited, angling the Valkyrie's prow straight at the last cruiser barring their path. The two ships hurtled toward each other, weapons blazing. The enemy's cannons gouged into the Valkyrie's armor, ripping entire plates free. Hull breaches erupted. Men were sucked into the void, their screams cut short. But still the Valkyrie didn't slow. The impact was cataclysmic. The Valkyrie's reinforced prow smashed into the alien cruiser's spine, tearing it in half with a thunderous groan of rending metal. Fires erupted as atmosphere vented, the enemy ship folding around them like paper. Both vessels spun apart, fragments scattering into space. On the bridge, alarms shrieked. Men were thrown from their stations. One officer's console exploded, shrapnel ripping through his throat. He collapsed in a pool of blood, choking, gurgling. "Report!" Harlon barked. Structural integrity down to 50%, the engineer cried. Hull compromised across multiple decks. Reactor still stable, for now. Harlon slammed his fist into his armrest. Then we're still alive. Keep fighting. They punched through the wreckage, engines blazing, the stars opening wide before them. Behind, the enemy swarmed to regroup, but they had bought themselves a sliver of space. Commander, Lyra said, voice taut, we can't keep this up. We'll burn out before we finish half of them. Harlon's eyes burned as he stared at the screen, watching the red swarm of enemy ships reorganize, spreading out to envelop them again. We don't need half, he growled. We just need enough. Enough to remind them. Enough to carve the memory of this night into their bones. The communications officer shouted suddenly, Incoming transmission from the fleet! Put it through. A hologram crackled to life above the bridge, the image of a high-ranking alien admiral. His face was reptilian, scales gleaming under harsh light, eyes burning with outrage. His voice was a guttural snarl, translated into human speech by the comms AI. Human filth, the admiral spat. You dare desecrate this sacred night with your pathetic defiance? You are dust. Remnants of a dead species clinging to life like vermin. We will tear your ship apart piece by piece, and when your body drifts frozen among the wreckage, no one will even remember your name. Harlon stepped forward, staring into the admiral's slit-pupiled eyes. His voice was cold steel. Remember it now. Commander Harlon, Earthfleet. And when you see your emperor burning in hell, tell him humanity sent you. He cut the channel before the admiral could respond. The crew stared at him, some with wide eyes, others with grim smiles. For a moment, the weight of fear lifted, replaced by something harder, sharper. Defiance. Then the enemy came again. Wave after wave of ships bore down on them, a storm of fire and metal. The Valkyrie weaved and struck, guns roaring, tearing through destroyers and corvettes that dared get close. Fighters swarmed like gnats, pelting the hull with missiles, strafing across the bridge. Point defense cannons spat them down, but still they came, endless. The ship shook under constant fire. Bulkheads ruptured, fires spread unchecked through lower decks. Medical bays overflowed with the wounded, screams echoing through the halls. The Valkyrie was dying, but she wasn't dead yet. Commander! Lyra shouted, eyes wide. They've deployed battleships, 3 of them, closing fast. On the screen, 3 colossal warships loomed, each dwarfing the Valkyrie. Their guns glowed with lethal energy, enough to shred their shields in seconds. Harlon's lips curled into a snarl. Then we go for the throat. Helm, take us straight at the center ship. All weapons fire. The Valkyrie dove again, charging headlong into the teeth of the battleships. Their guns blazed, beams ripping into the Valkyrie's shields. The barrier collapsed in a burst of sparks, and raw energy slammed into the hull, carving molten craters across the armor. Men were burned alive in their stations. Entire compartments vanished in firestorms. Shields gone, the engineer screamed. Then we fight naked, Harlon roared. Fire everything. The Valkyrie's guns unleashed hell. Railguns fired slug after slug, tearing into the battleship's forward armor. Plasma torpedoes streaked into its flanks, detonating in brilliant blossoms of fire. One of the alien battleships staggered, its hull cracking, but the others closed in. A beam lanced across the Valkyrie's port side, vaporizing half a deck. Another struck the starboard engines, sending the ship spinning. Stabilize her, Harlon barked. Engines crippled, the helmsman cried. The ship lurched, groaning, but Harlon only gritted his teeth. Target their reactor. Put a hole through their heart. Lyra's hands danced, aiming the railguns with deadly precision. Firing! The slugs screamed through the void, punching deep into the battleship's core. For a moment, nothing. Then the alien vessel erupted in a chain reaction, its reactor going critical. The explosion tore through its bulk, splitting it apart in a blaze that consumed its escorts. The bridge crew cheered, voices hoarse, desperate. But the celebration was short-lived. Another beam raked across the Valkyrie, smashing through the bridge shields. The viewport cracked. Alarms howled, and the ship staggered again. "Commander," the engineer shouted. "If we keep burning the reactor like this, she's going to blow." Harlon's eyes blazed. "Then we take them with us." The bridge went silent. Every soul felt the weight of his words. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about legacy. If they died tonight, they would die carving scars into the Empire that would never heal. "Plot a course," Harlon said. "Straight for their command carriers. Let's make the bastards choke on our ashes." The Valkyrie, bleeding, burning, and broken, turned toward the heart of the fleet. And still, she roared. The Valkyrie was burning alive. Smoke choked the bridge, alarms blared in a deafening chorus, and sparks rained from shattered consoles. The air tasted of metal and blood, thick with the copper tang of men who had been torn apart at their stations. Yet through the hell, the ship still moved, engines groaning like dying lungs, weapons still firing, cutting swaths of death through the Empire's armada. "Damage report," Harlon roared, his voice a thunderclap over the chaos. The engineer, face blackened with soot, staggered upright. "Hull breaches across 5 decks. Structural integrity below 40%. Reactor holding, but, Commander, she's bleeding to death." "Not before they do," Harlon snapped. Lyra's voice cut through next, sharp and breathless. "Target carrier in range. Forward railguns primed." "Fire." The Valkyrie's guns boomed, launching molten slugs across the void. The first tore into the carrier's hangar bay, igniting fuel reserves in a chain of explosions. The second ripped through its command tower, shearing it clean off. The carrier folded in on itself, venting fire and twisted bodies into space. On the tactical screen, the enemy fleet writhed, formations broken by the chaos of one ship they could not kill. Yet more converged from every side. Battleships closing ranks, destroyers racing to swarm. The sheer size of the armada was overwhelming, a tide of steel and fire that no sane commander would dare confront. But Harlon wasn't sane anymore. He had nothing left but vengeance. "Helm," he barked, his eyes locked on the cluster of red icons representing the Empire's command carriers. "Plot a direct course, straight through." The helmsman's face was pale, blood trickling from a cut on his brow. His voice cracked. "Commander, that's suicide." Harlon's eyes snapped to him, cold and merciless. "So is breathing. Set the course." The man swallowed, then obeyed. The Valkyrie surged forward again, engines screaming, reactor bleeding power it no longer had to give. The ship's frame groaned, plates warping under the strain, but still she moved, a burning spear of defiance plunging into the belly of an empire. "Enemy battleships moving to intercept," Lyra shouted. "They'll cut us apart before we reach the carriers." Harlon slammed his fist into the armrest. "Then we cut them first. All batteries. Fire at will." The Valkyrie unleashed hell. Railguns spat molten death, tearing through the armored hides of cruisers and destroyers. Plasma torpedoes screamed into enemy formations, detonating in blinding blossoms of fire. Point defense cannons raked the swarms of fighters that buzzed like wasps, cutting them down in showers of flame. One battleship took a slug straight through its reactor. The explosion was so violent it shattered the ships beside it, ripping them into fragments that spun into the void. Another staggered under torpedo fire, its spine cracking as it broke apart in a spray of debris. But every kill came at a cost. Enemy beams carved into the Valkyrie's sides, vaporizing armor, tearing deep into her guts. Hull breaches spread. Whole sections went dark. Reports screamed across the comms of fires raging out of control, of medbays overwhelmed with bodies, of decks lost to the vacuum. "Section 14 is gone," a voice cried through static. "Casualties mounting, Commander," the comms officer shouted. "We've lost a third of the crew." Harlon didn't flinch. He couldn't. His voice cut through the despair like steel. "Then the rest fight harder." On the lower decks, men fought fires with bare hands when extinguishers failed, skin blistering as they smothered flames with their bodies. Medics stitched wounds in blood-slick corridors, their supplies long gone, their hands trembling as they tried to keep dying soldiers breathing for one more minute. Some didn't even bother treating themselves, collapsing against walls with burns and shrapnel embedded, refusing to abandon their posts. They all knew they wouldn't survive this. And still, they fought. The Valkyrie pushed into the densest cluster of the enemy fleet, guns blazing, a glowing ember cutting a burning trail through the night. Every explosion lit the void with defiance, every kill a scream of rage from a race that refused to stay dead. On the bridge, Harlon's hands were steady, his voice never cracked. But inside, his blood boiled with grief. Every console that went silent, every crewman who slumped forward in a spray of sparks, was another ghost on his conscience. He saw their faces, and he forced himself to keep going. Because if he stopped, if he let himself falter for even a moment, everything they had already lost would mean nothing. Lyra's voice broke his thoughts. "Commander, new contact. Their Grand Admiral's ship. It's moving to block our path." The tactical screen highlighted it. A colossal dreadnought, black and jagged, bristling with weapons that dwarfed even the Emperor's flagship. Its engines burned bright as it positioned itself between the Valkyrie and the command carriers, flanked by an honor guard of warships. The crew stared in silence. It was suicide made flesh, a wall they couldn't possibly break. Harlon rose from his chair, stepping forward into the smoke-filled air, eyes locked on the massive vessel ahead. His jaw was iron, his voice a growl. "Good. Then we'll carve our names into their wall." The dreadnought's first salvo struck. A storm of energy beams hammered into the Valkyrie, tearing deep into her hull. One shot blew apart the starboard weapons deck, the explosion rippling through corridors and incinerating every man stationed there. Another lanced through engineering, killing dozens instantly. "Engineering is hit!" the engineer screamed over the comms. "We've lost coolant flow. Reactors overheating. We're on a countdown now." "How long?" Harlon demanded. "Minutes, maybe less." The ship was dying. "Then let's make those minutes count," Harlon said, his voice raw but unshaken. The Valkyrie answered with fury. Railguns thundered, hammering into the dreadnought's shields, making them flare and ripple. Plasma torpedoes streaked out, detonating against its armor. Fighters screamed around them. But the Valkyrie's cannons shredded them in bursts of fire. The dreadnought's shields flickered. Then again. But they held. "Shields not breaking!" Lyra cried. "Reactors spiking!" the engineer shouted. "If we keep firing like this, she'll blow on her own." Harlon's eyes narrowed. His decision was already made. "Then we ram her." The bridge froze. "Commander," Lyra began, horror in her voice. "Helm," Harlon barked, cutting her off. "All power to engines. Plot collision course, straight into that bastard's throat." The helmsman's hands trembled. His lips parted, but then he looked at Harlon and saw the fire in his eyes. Slowly, he nodded. "Aye, sir." The Valkyrie turned, her battered frame groaning as engines flared, driving her straight toward the alien dreadnought. Weapons fire slammed into them from every side, beams carving, missiles detonating, hull tearing apart piece by piece. But still she came, a burning spear driving into the night. On the lower decks, men braced against walls, clutching whatever they could as the ship screamed forward. Some prayed, some cursed, some laughed through bloodied teeth, knowing they were about to take an empire with them, The dreadnought unleashed hell, every cannon pouring fire into the Valkyrie. The bridge shook violently. Consoles burst. The viewport cracked, spiderwebbing under the strain. "Structural integrity 20%, the engineer cried. "Closer," Harlon growled, eyes fixed on the looming monster ahead. The dreadnought filled the screen now, a mountain of black steel bristling with fire. Its shields flared under the Valkyrie's constant barrage, weakening, but still holding. 10 seconds to collision, the helmsman shouted. "Reactor critical!" Harlon stood tall, his voice carrying like thunder. "All hands, brace for impact!" The Valkyrie screamed forward, her reactor boiling, her guns blazing one last time. The dreadnought's shields flickered, strained, then shattered in a burst of light. The Valkyrie hit. The impact was cataclysmic. The prow drove deep into the dreadnought's spine, tearing through decks, ripping through armor, gouging a burning path through the heart of the beast. The reactor, already critical, went into meltdown. And then the Valkyrie exploded. The blast was a sun born in the heart of the fleet. It tore the dreadnought apart, splitting it in half as fire consumed its bulk. The explosion spread outward, a tidal wave of destruction that engulfed its escorts, tearing them apart in chain reactions. Hundreds of ships were caught in the blast, their hulls rupturing, their reactors igniting, the fleet unraveling in fire and chaos. The heavens lit with humanity's last scream. On the bridge, as fire engulfed everything, Harlon's last thought wasn't of revenge. It wasn't of hatred. It was of Earth, blue seas, green fields, skies unscarred by war. And he smiled. The galaxy would never forget this night. The void was silent. Where once the Empire's fleet had stood in flawless symmetry, now there was only ruin. The night sky was a graveyard of burning hulks, shattered wreckage tumbling endlessly through the void. Fires still licked at torn hulls, spilling oxygen into space like a bleeding wound. Thousands of ships lay broken, their once proud formations twisted into chaos. And at the center of it all, a wound burned brighter than the rest, the skeletal remains of the Grand Admiral's dreadnought, split in half by the final charge of the Valkyrie. Its colossal frame still glowed red-hot, molten rivers of metal spilling into the darkness. Entire decks floated away in jagged fragments. What had been the pride of the fleet was now a tomb drifting silently through the wreckage of its escorts. For a long moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The Empire's fleet, so vast, so invincible, stared into the abyss where one human ship had made a mockery of them all. Aboard a nearby cruiser, Admiral Verax stood frozen at the viewport, his scaled hands gripping the railing so tightly his claws cut grooves into the steel. His reptilian eyes reflected the carnage outside, the fire still consuming half his fleet. His chest heaved with rage, disbelief, and a poison he had never tasted before. Fear. This is impossible, one of his lieutenants whispered behind him, voice trembling. One ship! One human ship! Silence, Verax snarled, spinning with a whip of his tail. His voice cracked the air like a lash. Do not speak their name in my presence again. But the words felt hollow, for even as he spoke them, the image of the Valkyrie seared itself deeper into his mind. The glowing spear of a vessel tearing into the dreadnought, the explosion that had consumed half the fleet. He would never forget it. None of them would. The bridge of his cruiser was silent, save for the faint hiss of damaged consoles and the ragged breathing of men who had never seen defeat. They were not supposed to lose. They were the Empire. They were eternal. And yet one ship of a dead race had shown them otherwise. Verax's comm officer turned, his scales pale. Admiral, the fleet is in disarray. Command ships destroyed. Communications broken. We've lost central coordination. Regroup them! Verax roared, though his voice lacked its usual authority. Reform ranks! Hunt down the survivors! There are no survivors, the officer said softly. The words hung in the air like a blade. Verax turned back to the viewport. The human warship was gone, obliterated in its final blaze. There would be no prisoners, no survivors to interrogate, no carcass to parade through the Empire's streets. The humans had denied them even that. They had chosen their death, and in doing so, they had scarred the Empire. Across the Armada, whispers spread like wildfire, carried on open channels, on hushed voices in shattered mess halls, on the panicked reports of captains who no longer knew what to believe. A name spoken again and again, one they had thought extinct. Human. Far from the fleet, on Kiros Prime itself, the Emperor's victory celebration had turned to chaos. The Great Hall, filled with banners and nobles, had fallen into a stunned silence when the first images of the destruction appeared on the grand screens. At first they thought it propaganda, a trick by rebels. But as ship after ship confirmed the carnage, the truth became undeniable. One human warship had shattered the Emperor's armada in a single night. Nobles fled the chamber. Guards shouted orders. Panic rippled through the streets of the capital as rumors spread faster than truth. To the common people, it didn't matter if the Empire would recover. What mattered was that the Empire had bled. And if the Eternal Throne could bleed, then it could die. But the legend did not end there. Fragments of the Valkyrie still drifted in the void, scattered across the battlefield like bones of a giant. Among the wreckage, a few escape pods floated dark, their signals faint but alive. Against all odds, some of the crew had survived the inferno. One pod was recovered by a neutral scavenger vessel days later, its hull scorched, air filters clogged with ash. Inside, 3 men and 1 woman clung to life. Their bodies were broken, their skin burned, their eyes hollow from what they had witnessed. But when asked who they were, when asked what ship they had come from, they spoke with cracked lips and bleeding throats. The Valkyrie. Word spread faster than fire in dry grass. Across the stars, whispers turned to stories, and stories into legend. Traders carried the tale from port to port. Smugglers spoke of it in hushed tones. Soldiers of conquered worlds raised their heads for the first time in generations. Humanity, they said, had been erased, but humanity had returned. And in one night, they had reminded the galaxy of their fury. Rebellions long buried began to stir. Chains that had felt unbreakable suddenly seemed weaker. For if one ship could do this, what could 100 do? What could 1,000? The Empire tried to silence the story. They executed anyone who spoke the word human. They burned records, destroyed footage, denied the truth, but they could not erase the stars themselves, still scarred by the wreckage of the fleet. They could not silence the fire that now burned in the hearts of the oppressed. Even their own soldiers whispered in secret, remembering the fear that had crawled down their spines as the Valkyrie charged the dreadnought. They had faced death before, but never had they faced that. The Empire's grip had cracked, and through that crack, the ghost of humanity seeped like smoke. For Admiral Verax, the shame was unbearable. He stood before the Emperor weeks later, in the cold halls of the throne. The air was thick with incense, banners of stars hanging heavy above, the floor polished black as obsidian. Verax knelt, his scales pressed against the stone, his head bowed low. "Explain," the Emperor said, his voice a hiss like knives drawn from their sheaths. Verax's throat tightened. He had faced warlords, rebellions, and 1,000 battles, but never had words weighed this heavy. "One ship, my Emperor, a human vessel. We believed them extinct. It was unlike any vessel we have encountered. Their commander, he rammed the dreadnought. He sacrificed— Sacrifice? The Emperor cut in, his voice sharp as venom. You mean to tell me that vermin, cornered and broken, dared to spit in my face, and you let them? Verax's jaw tightened, rage simmering under his shame. My Emperor, no one could have predicted. No one but them, the Emperor hissed. The humans have always been vermin. Cornered, they bite. Weak, they cling. Dying, they burn. And yet you allowed them to burn my fleet. 500,000 lives, gone in a night. The Emperor rose, his black robes flowing like smoke, his eyes burning with fury. You will rebuild what they destroyed, Verax. You will scour the stars for their remnants, and if you fail me again, you will not kneel, you will crawl. Verax bowed lower, hatred boiling in his chest. Not hatred for the Emperor, but for the humans who had made him kneel in shame. But deep inside, behind the rage and bitterness, there was something else. Something that made his scales prickle and his tail twitch with unease. Fear. In the shadows of the galaxy, beyond the reach of the Empire, the legend grew. Rebellions adopted the name Valkyrie as their banner. Graffiti scrawled on city walls bore the word human. Smugglers painted the silhouette of a warship on their hulls. In backwater taverns, songs were sung not of loss, but of defiance. Children of conquered worlds played games where they pretended to be the humans who had destroyed the Emperor's fleet. And in their eyes burned a fire that had long been extinguished. Humanity had died, but the Valkyrie had made them immortal. And somewhere, drifting in the silence of the wreckage, a single escape pod spun endlessly through the void, its beacon faint but unbroken. Inside, one man still breathed. His chest rose and fell shallowly, blood crusting his face, burns crawling across his skin. His eyes flickered open, staring at the stars beyond the cracked viewport. Commander Harlon, barely alive. The universe thought him dead. The Empire believed him gone. The legend of the Valkyrie already burned brighter than truth. But Harlon was still here. And in the faint rhythm of his heart, a promise remained. This was not the end. This was the beginning. Darkness. It clung to him like chains, thick and endless, pulling him down into silence. For a long time there was nothing but the void. No sound, no light, no breath. He thought maybe this was death. And for a moment that was fine. He had earned it. He had burned the Empire's heart and dragged it into hell with him. What more could a dying man ask for? But then came the pain. It started as a spark, a cruel reminder that his body still existed. His chest burned. His ribs felt like shattered glass grinding with every shallow breath. His skin stung as if the fire still licked at him. He wanted to sink back into the dark, but pain had other plans. His eyes opened. The viewport above him was cracked, spiderweb lines running through it, but beyond the fractured glass, the stars still burned, cold, endless, indifferent. The wreckage of war floated past, twisted beams, shattered plating, bodies frozen mid-scream, drifting forever in silence. Harlon tried to move. Agony shot through his body like lightning. He coughed, blood spraying his lips, dark against the stale air of the pod. The filters were failing. He could taste the rot of smoke and metal. He was alive. Barely. He forced his head to the side. The escape pod was small, barely enough space for one man, its walls scorched, the controls cracked and flickering. A faint red light blinked weakly above the console, emergency beacon still transmitting. How long? His voice rasped like sandpaper, the sound barely audible. He didn't know. He didn't remember ejecting. Maybe someone else had shoved him in before the Valkyrie exploded. Maybe fate had played a cruel trick, sparing him when so many better men had burned. He didn't care. All he knew was that he had failed. The Valkyrie was gone. His crew was gone. And yet he lived. The thought cut him deeper than any wound. For days or hours, he couldn't tell, he drifted in the pod. Time bled together in the silence. He slept, he woke, he coughed, he bled. He stared at the stars, the same stars that had once belonged to humanity, now stolen by an empire that thought itself eternal. He wondered if anyone would ever find him, or if he would simply rot here, another corpse floating among the ruins. Then the pod shuddered. At first he thought it was the hallucination of a dying brain. But no. The stars shifted, shadows passed over the viewport. A ship loomed above, small and ragged, its hull patched with scars, engines sputtering. Not imperial. Too crude, too human. A voice crackled through the pod's dead comms, distorted but real. "Unidentified pod, this is the Ashen Crow. If you can hear us, hold on. We've got you." Harlon let out a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. When he woke again, it was to light. Not the sterile white of imperial ships, but the flickering orange of old lamps. He lay on a stretcher in a cramped med bay, walls patched with metal scraps, wires hanging loose like vines. The air smelled of oil and stale oxygen. A face leaned over him. A man, scarred, stubble on his jaw, eyes sunken but sharp. "You're awake," the stranger said. His voice carried the rough edge of a miner, not a soldier. "We didn't think you'd make it." Harlan's lips cracked as he forced words out. "Where am I?" "The Ashen Crow," the man replied. "We're scavengers. Picked up your pod drifting near Kairos. Lucky bastard. You were nearly fried." Harlon tried to sit up, pain tearing through his body. The man pressed him down with a firm hand. "Easy. You're half dead. Took burns, broken ribs, internal bleeding. Doc says it's a miracle you're breathing." Harlan's eyes narrowed. "Why save me?" The man smirked faintly. "Because we know who you are." Silence. "You're Harlon," the scavenger continued. "Commander of the Valkyrie. The man who shattered the Empire's fleet." Harlan's stomach twisted. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a corpse wearing borrowed skin. "That ship's gone," he rasped. "My crew's gone. I failed." The scavenger shook his head. "Failed? You lit the galaxy on fire. Every world's whispering your name. The Empire's choking on it, and the people are starting to believe again. You didn't fail, Commander. You gave us something to fight for." Harlon turned away, staring at the flickering lamp above. His chest tightened. He hadn't meant to inspire anyone. He hadn't cared about legend or hope. He had wanted revenge, nothing more. But now. "Where are you headed?" he asked. The man hesitated. "Outskirts, outer colonies. Places the Empire doesn't care to look. People out there. They're starting to organize. They want to fight back. Small cells, ragtag fleets. Nothing compared to the Empire, but they need a symbol," Harlon finished bitterly. The scavenger smirked. "And you're it, whether you like it or not." Weeks passed. Harlan's body healed slowly, his bones knitting, his burns scarred over. He spent most of his time in silence, staring at the rusted walls of the Ashen Crow, haunted by faces of his lost crew. Every scream, every sacrifice, carved into his skull. Yet as his strength returned, so too did his fire. He began to walk the ship, speaking with the crew. They were miners, smugglers, refugees, broken men and women who had lost everything to the Empire. But in their eyes, when they looked at him, there was a light. Not fear, not pity. Hope. One night, the scavenger captain gathered the crew. A projector flickered to life, displaying transmissions from across the galaxy, grainy footage of riots on Imperial worlds, graffiti of a human warship painted on walls. Smugglers raising banners with the word Valkyrie scrawled across them. Rebellion sparking in systems long thought crushed. "It's happening," the captain said, his voice low but fierce. The Empire's cracks are showing, and they all trace back to one ship, one night, one man. All eyes turned to Harlon. He felt the weight of it pressing down on him. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't wanted to be a symbol. He had only wanted vengeance, but now vengeance had grown teeth, and the galaxy was hungry. He stood slowly, his voice hoarse but unshaken. "If they want a symbol," he said, "then we give them more than whispers." "The Empire thinks humanity is dust. Let's make them choke on our ashes." The crew erupted into cheers, voices echoing through the battered hull. For the first time since the Valkyrie burned, Harlon felt something other than grief. Purpose. The Ashen Crow became a beacon in the dark. From colony to colony, it carried Harlon like a ghost, spreading whispers that the commander of the Valkyrie still lived. At first, people didn't believe. Then they saw him. Scarred, hollow-eyed, but breathing. And belief turned to fire. Cells of rebels began to unite, drawn by his presence. Smugglers offered ships, miners offered weapons carved from ore. Even deserters from the Empire crept from the shadows, swearing loyalty to the man who had made their fleets bleed. They didn't have much: old freighters, patched warships, stolen guns. But they had something the Empire could never crush. They had faith. And they had Harlon. Late one night, standing at the viewport of the Ashen Crow, Harlon stared out at the stars. His reflection stared back, scarred, gaunt, older than he felt. Behind him, the scavenger captain approached quietly. "You've seen what's happening," the captain said. "They'll follow you anywhere. But we both know what that means. You've made yourself a target. The Empire will hunt you harder than anyone alive." Harlon's jaw tightened. "Good." The captain frowned. "Good?" Harlon turned, his eyes burning with that same fire that had driven him into the heart of the fleet. "They tried to erase us. They burned our worlds, slaughtered our people, spit on our graves. But they made a mistake. They left me breathing." His hand curled into a fist, knuckles white. "They think the Valkyrie was the end. It wasn't. It was the beginning. We'll build more ships. We'll burn more fleets. And one day we won't just scar their empire. We'll end it." The captain stared at him, then nodded slowly. "Then it starts here." And in the silence of the void, among the scattered embers of war, humanity's ghost began to rise again. The Ashen Crow was no warship, but it became a throne of sorts. From its rusted decks, Commander Harlon watched the rebirth of a people the galaxy had written off as extinct. At first it was a trickle, broken men and women arriving in patched freighters, battered gunboats, and stolen cargo haulers, miners from the asteroid belts of Tyros, smugglers from the shadow routes of the Outer Rim, soldiers who had once worn imperial uniforms but deserted after seeing what the Valkyrie had done. They came with little, scavenged rifles, old engines, ships held together by welds and prayer. But they came because they had heard the name. Harlon, the man who had destroyed the Emperor's fleet in a single night. They whispered it like a curse against the Empire, like a prayer for revenge. And when they saw him in the flesh, scarred, gaunt, eyes hollow but burning, they believed. On the cargo deck of the Ashen Crow, surrounded by rusted crates and flickering lamps, the first council of rebels gathered. Dozens of captains stood shoulder to shoulder, men with oil-stained hands and women with plasma burns across their skin. No uniforms. No ranks. Just survivors. The scavenger captain who had saved Harlon spoke first. "We've all seen what the Empire can do. Worlds burned, families slaughtered. They think they own the stars, but one ship proved otherwise. The Valkyrie carved a hole in their pride they can't close. Now it's our turn to widen it." The crowd muttered, voices thick with anger. Harlon stepped forward, and the noise fell into silence. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "The Empire believes humanity is dust," he said, his words sharp as broken glass. "They think we're gone, forgotten. But you know better. You've seen what one ship can do. One ship against 1,000. Imagine 100. Imagine a fleet." The men leaned in. Their eyes gleamed. "We don't have their numbers. We don't have their factories. But we have something they never will. We have nothing left to lose. And men with nothing left to lose are the deadliest kind." A murmur of approval rippled through the chamber. "We'll strike their supply lines," Harlon continued. "We'll bleed them dry. We'll turn every forgotten colony, every broken world into a dagger at their throat. And when they finally choke on their own arrogance, we'll be waiting to finish it." The chamber erupted in cheers, fists pounding against steel, voices roaring like thunder. For the first time since Earth burned, humanity wasn't dying. It was rising. The fleet that formed was ragtag, a patchwork of rusted hulls and stolen weapons, but it grew faster than the Empire could have imagined. Ships long buried in scrapyards were resurrected. Mining vessels were refitted with cannons. Old freighters were reinforced with armor plating scavenged from wrecks. The rebels called it the Ghost Fleet, not because it was invisible, but because it shouldn't exist. To the Empire, it was an impossibility. Harlon drilled them mercilessly. He was no longer the desperate man charging into the teeth of death. He was a commander reborn, every scar a lesson, every loss a weapon. He turned smugglers into gunners, miners into engineers, deserters into soldiers. Discipline where there had been chaos, purpose where there had been only rage. And when the Ghost Fleet was ready, he led them into their first strike. The target was small by Imperial standards, a fuel convoy supplying a fleet garrison in the Zoraya sector. 3 carriers, a dozen escorts, and transport haulers heavy with volatile fuel. To the Empire, it was routine. To Harlon, it was blood waiting to be spilled. The Ghost Fleet descended like wolves. They dropped from slipspace in a ragged line, hulls scarred, engines sputtering, but their weapons burning hot. The first volley tore into the escorts, plasma torpedoes ripping ships apart before they could even raise shields. Railguns spat molten slugs that punctured carriers like paper, fuel igniting in brilliant blossoms of fire. "Keep them moving," Harlon barked over comms, his voice calm amid the storm. "Hit and run! Don't get bogged down!" The rebels moved like predators unleashed. Freighters turned gunboats darted between the Imperial vessels, hammering their flanks. Mining barges. Their drills converted into ramming spikes, skewered transports, tearing them open as fuel spilled into the void. Fires spread, explosions chained, the convoy unraveling into chaos. The Empire tried to respond. Carriers launched fighters in swarms, but the Ghost Fleet had learned from the Valkyrie. Point defense cannons shredded them, while gunboats drew them into ambushes where they were torn apart by crossfire. In less than an hour, the convoy was ash. The rebels didn't linger. They stripped what fuel they could, seized weapons, and vanished into the black before reinforcements could arrive. When the Empire reached the wreckage, all they found were burning hulks and graffiti scrawled into the sides of shattered ships. Valkyrie lives. Word spread faster than the Empire could contain it. Entire sectors buzzed with the tale. For every world that had once believed resistance was futile, the Ghost Fleet became proof that the Empire could bleed. Riots erupted in cities across Imperial space. Garrisons found themselves besieged by civilians, armed with nothing but stolen rifles and hatred. Conquered species whispered the name human like it was a curse against the throne. The Emperor ordered the stories silenced. He commanded executions, crackdowns, terror campaigns. But the harder he pressed, the more the fire spread, and at the center of it all was Harlon. Inside the command bay of the Ashen Crow, now converted into the Ghost Fleet's flagship, Harlon stood over a tactical display. Red icons glowed across the map. Imperial supply lines, depots, weak points. Each one was a wound waiting to be opened. Lyra, the weapons officer who had somehow survived by ejecting earlier in the battle, leaned on the console beside him. Her face was pale, her hair streaked with gray that hadn't been there months ago. She had found him again through whispers of his survival and sworn she would never leave his side. "You're becoming a ghost story," she said, her voice low. "Half the fleet thinks you're already dead, that you're just some kind of spirit leading them." Harlan's lips curled faintly. "Maybe that's better. A dead man doesn't bleed." She studied him for a long moment. "But you do." He didn't answer. The comms officer interrupted, his voice tight. "Commander, new reports coming in. 3 more cells want to join us. 1 from the Arkan colonies, another from the border mines, and... Sir, this one's different. An Imperial frigate. Deserted. They're asking for asylum." The room went still. "An Imperial frigate?" Lyra repeated. "Yes, ma'am. They say they've had enough. They say they saw what the Valkyrie did. They want to fight for us." Harlan's eyes narrowed. "Bring them in. Strip their codes, strip their weapons, strip their pride. If they bleed the Empire, they stay." The comms officer nodded. Lyra shook her head. "You're building something dangerous, Harlon. Not just a fleet, a firestorm." "That's the point," he said quietly. The Ghost Fleet struck again and again. Supply convoys, outposts, shipyards. They didn't hold territory. They couldn't. But they left scars wherever they went, scars the Empire could not hide. One night, in the black of deep space, Harlon addressed the fleet. His voice carried across every channel, through the crackle of ancient comms, through ships barely held together, through the hearts of men who had thought they were alone. "We are ghosts," he said. "They burned our worlds, they erased our names, but we are still here. And every time we strike, we remind them of the truth they fear most. Humanity cannot be killed. Not by fire, not by fleets, not by empires. Tonight we rise from the ashes. Tonight we are the Valkyrie." The fleet roared back in unison, voices merging into a single howl of defiance. And in that moment, the galaxy trembled. The trap was inevitable. Harlon knew it the moment their strikes grew bolder, the moment deserters and rebels began to rally not just in whispers but in fleets. The Empire was too proud, too enraged to let the Ghost Fleet bleed them forever. Sooner or later they would come. Sooner or later they would bring everything. And when they did, the galaxy would be watching. The fleet gathered in the shadow of the shattered moon of Dargath, its surface littered with jagged craters, its orbit cloaked in debris. The Ghost Fleet had swelled beyond recognition. Hundreds of ships now, patched together from scrapyards, stolen yards. Even captured Imperial hulls repainted in the black and red of rebellion. Miners' barges bristled with cannons. Smugglers' freighters wore armor like scars, and old warships, long thought dead, drifted with engines rekindled. It wasn't order, it wasn't beauty, but it was alive. And at its heart stood the Ashen Crow, reborn as a command vessel, its rust and scars worn proudly. In its command bay, Harlon stood before the gathered captains, his eyes hard, his voice iron. "They're coming," he said. "We all know it. The Empire won't ignore us any longer. They'll throw everything they have to snuff us out, and when they do, we won't run. We won't scatter. We'll stand. Because this fight isn't just about us anymore. It's about every world that's ever been burned, every people they've ever enslaved, every soul that's ever bent a knee to their throne. Tonight, we show them we're done kneeling." The room buzzed with grim resolve. No one needed to be convinced. They were already dead men walking, and they knew it. But like the Valkyrie before them, they were determined to make their deaths echo across the stars. "Commander," Lyra said quietly, standing at his side, "you realize what this means. We won't survive this." Harlon turned to her, his scarred face shadowed under the dim light. "We don't have to. We just have to make sure they remember." They came at dawn, if dawn meant anything in the void. The Empire's fleet bled out of slip space in waves, dwarfing the Ghost Fleet in size and firepower. Thousands of ships bristling with guns, flanked by carriers vomiting fighters, led by dreadnoughts whose hulls gleamed like mountains of black steel. Their banners of stars blazed in defiance, their formation perfect, their numbers overwhelming. It was the largest armada assembled since the burning of Earth, and all of it bore down on a fleet of scavengers, smugglers, and ghosts. On the bridge of the Ashen Crow, Harlon stood tall as the first wave approached. His voice carried steady across every channel. "Ghost Fleet, you know who they are. You know what they've taken. Today, we take it back. Today, we remind them we are not prey. We are the predators they caged. We are humanity. Fire at will." The void lit up. The first clash was chaos. The Ghost Fleet surged forward in a ragged line, weapons blazing. Plasma torpedoes streaked across the black, tearing through the Empire's vanguard. Railguns thundered, molten slugs punching holes in destroyers. Mining barges rammed frigates. Drills tearing through hulls in showers of sparks. The Empire responded with fury. Beams of raw energy carved through the rebels, splitting ships apart in blinding fire. Carriers unleashed swarms of fighters, filling the void like locusts. Dreadnoughts spat death from their titanic cannons, tearing through whole formations with single volleys. The Ghost Fleet bled. Ships died screaming, their crews burning or vented into the void. But for every rebel ship lost, an Imperial vessel burned with it. For every scream, there was vengeance. Harlon's commands cut through the storm. "Group 3, flank left. Gunboats, focus fire on their carriers. Don't give them time to regroup. Hit them harder." The rebels fought like wolves, tearing into the Empire's ordered lines with reckless fury. They didn't match formation with formation, didn't play the Empire's game. They broke it. They swarmed. They struck where it hurt, even if it cost them their lives. The Empire had numbers. The Ghost Fleet had nothing left to lose. On the second hour of battle, the first dreadnought fell. A dozen rebel ships hurled themselves at it, shields buckling under concentrated fire. The dreadnought's cannons tore them apart one by one, but each death brought another strike closer. Finally, a mining barge packed with explosives rammed its flank. The detonation ripped through its core, splitting the behemoth in half. The cheer that erupted across the fleet wasn't joy. It was fury. It was hunger. "They can bleed!" voices roared over comms. "Take more of them with us!" But the Empire pressed harder. Reinforcements poured in from slip space, their numbers endless. The Ghost Fleet dwindled. Ship by ship, flame by flame, they were torn apart. On the Ashen Crow, the deck shook as beams grazed its hull. Sparks rained. Men screamed. But Harlon stood unflinching, his eyes locked on the tactical screen. "Lyra," he said. She turned. Her face streaked with blood and sweat. "What is it?" "They'll break us soon, but if we drive straight through their center, we can hit their command carriers. If we kill their admirals, their lines will collapse." Lyra's eyes widened. "That's suicide." Harlon's jaw tightened. "So was the Valkyrie. Look what it did." She stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Then let's make them choke." The Ashen Crow surged forward, leading the charge. Around it, the remnants of the Ghost Fleet followed, a ragged spear of burning ships plunging into the heart of the Empire's armada. The Empire's guns turned on them at once. The void became a storm of fire, beams lancing, torpedoes streaking, explosions tearing apart ship after ship. The rebels died in droves, but they didn't falter. Every death carried them closer. The Ashen Crow's guns spat fire into the command carriers, ripping into their shields. Other rebel ships joined, hammering them with everything they had. Shields flickered, strained, then collapsed. Carriers burned, admirals screamed over failing comms. Lines faltered. The Empire's perfect formation cracked, and through that crack, rebellion poured. Across the galaxy, broadcasts carried the battle live. Smugglers transmitted it on hidden channels. Civilians hijacked Imperial relays to spread it across conquered worlds. Billions watched as the Ghost Fleet, outnumbered 100 to 1, tore the pride of the Empire into fire and ruin. And in every home, in every slum, in every prison camp, people whispered the same words: humanity lives. But victory was not for the rebels. The Empire's numbers were endless. For every carrier that burned, another arrived. For every dreadnought cracked, 2 more loomed from slip space. The Ghost Fleet was drowning in fire. On the Ashen Crow, alarms screamed. Hull breaches tore through its sides. Fires raged unchecked. Men and women died at their stations. Harlon stood at the center, his eyes blazing. "Reactors overheating?" The engineer's voice crackled through static. "She won't hold another minute, Commander. She's going critical." Harlon looked to Lyra. Her eyes were wet but unbroken. "One more time," she whispered. "One more time," he said. He turned to the comms, his voice steady as iron. "Ghost Fleet, you've given everything. Now give them the rest. Aim for their carriers. Ram them. Burn them. Let the galaxy see us die screaming." The fleet roared back, a chorus of defiance. And they did. One by one, burning wrecks hurled themselves into the Empire's lines, detonating in fireballs that took carriers and cruisers with them. The Ashen Crow drove straight into the largest of the remaining command carriers, guns blazing until its reactor finally tore free. The explosion was apocalyptic. The carrier split apart, dragging dozens of ships with it. The shockwave rippled across the battlefield, scattering formations, engulfing fighters, leaving a scar the size of a world. When the fire cleared, the Ghost Fleet was gone. But so was half the Empire's armada. Silence returned to the void. The Empire had won. Technically, their ships still floated. Their banners still flew. But in that silence, in the fire that still burned, something had shifted. Because victory didn't feel like victory, it felt like fear. Across the galaxy, the broadcast of the battle replayed endlessly. Civilians saw miners ramming dreadnoughts, smugglers tearing carriers apart, rebels screaming defiance as they burned. They saw Harlon, scarred and unbroken, standing against impossible odds. The Empire had crushed the Ghost Fleet. But in doing so, they had birthed something far worse, a rebellion that would never die. And somewhere, deep in the wreckage, among drifting bodies and burning steel, a single pod ejected from the Ashen Crow before its final charge. Its beacon was faint, its hull scorched. Inside, one man lay broken, his breath shallow but steady. Commander Harlon. The galaxy thought him dead. The Empire declared him erased. But the whispers spread faster than truth. The Ghost Fleet had fallen. The rebellion had begun. And humanity's war was far from over.